Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our virtual panel on ethnic minorities in Cuba. My name is Jorge Duani, and I'm the director of the Cuban Research Institute, which sponsors today's event. Before we begin, I want to give a word of thanks to Jaime Correa, our public affairs managers at the Cuban Research Institute, and one of our work studies students, Ashley Nunez, for their support in setting up today's event. I'm pleased to briefly introduce our guest speakers. I'll be very brief because we do want to hear them, and we have 4 speakers today. Our first speaker will be Dr. Evelyn Hugh Dehart, who is a professor of history and the director of the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America at Brown University. She is the author of 3 books, and book chapters specializing on the Chinese diaspora in Cuba and other Latin American and Caribbean countries. She's also the co-author of the book Latino Politics and Ciencia Política, The Search for Latino Identity and Racial Consciousness, published in 2014. Today's talk by Dr. Hugh Dehart will be titled Un Barrio de Chinos Sin Chinos, Where Did the Chinese in Cuba Come From and Where Did They Go? Our second speaker will be Dr. Ruth Behar, who is the Victor Jaime Pereira Collegiate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Michigan. And she is the author of several books concentrating in the Jewish diaspora to Cuba, as well as the Cuban diaspora of the United States. And among her recent books, I would highlight the co-edition of The Portable Island, Cubans at Home in the World. Before that, she also authored the book An Island Called Home, Returning to Jewish Cuba. And she is also the editor of the very well-regarded compilation called Bridges to Cuba, Puentes a Cuba, published in 1995. More recently, she has published 2 works of fiction, which have done very well, Letters from Cuba in 2020 and Lucky Broken Girl in 2017. The title of Dr. Behar's presentation will be My Ancestors' Keys in Search of the Jews of Cuba. Next, we'll hear from John Ermer. John is a PhD candidate in Atlantic History at Florida International University here in Miami. His areas of concentration are Latin America, Cuba, the Caribbean, and the United States, with an emphasis on legal and immigration history. He holds a master's degree in modern American history from FIU and a bachelor's in political science and English from Florida State University. His doctoral dissertation, which focuses on today's topic, deals with how citizenship and immigration laws shape the identities of Arab migrants in Cuba between 1880 and 1980. His talk is titled Turcos y Moros, Lebanese and Syrian Migrants in Cuba. Our final panelist will be Elisa Romulo Borges, a PhD candidate in anthropology at FIU, who is also an adjunct instructor in the Asian Studies program at FIU. She earned her master's degree in Latin American and Caribbean Studies, as well as Asian Studies, and her bachelor's degree is in Spanish literature, as well as international relations and Asian studies. Her research seeks to expand the traditional notion of transculturation in the development of the Cuban nation by including the experiences of Asian immigrants, again, the topic of her talk today. Her presentation is titled Creating the Cuban Identity, Sociocultural Contributions of Japanese and Okinawan Descendants. So each of our panelists will have approximately 15 minutes to summarize their presentation so we can have enough time at the end for questions and answers with our virtual audience, and the entire event should be over by 1:30 p.m. You can submit your questions during and after the talks in the Ask a Question, actually the chat button at the bottom of your screen. And then at the end of the panel, we will pose as many questions as possible to the participants so that they can address your concerns. So without further ado, I give you Dr. Evelyn Hugh Dehart.
I'm looking for my share screen button. I don't see the share screen, Ashley. Okay, here we go. Okay, so I'm going to take you on just a minute. You see the best laid plans. Just a minute. Ashley?
Yes, if you click use slideshow on the top, you should be able
I
to
know,
share your
I
screen.
don't see, this thing is, I don't see my share screen. Can you give me the share screen again? Somehow I've lost. Okay, here we go, share screen. Okay. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, I don't have just a minute. I thought we had my PowerPoint. Okay. Can we, maybe Ruth should go first so we don't waste time? I'm lost my,
We can see your PowerPoint perfectly.
yeah, but I don't see my Zoom, okay, can we see it now? But I don't see my,
Yes.
okay. Can we see it? Are you all? Okay. So I want to talk to you about where are the Chinos in Cuba today. So El Barrio Chino Sin Chinos, no? So I'm going to start by taking you on a quick walk down memory lane through the gates of Chinatown. This is a gate to Havana, Chinatown. It was a gift from the Chinese government, built in the 1980s, so it's fairly new. And just quickly walk through the streets of Chinatown and pay attention to what you see. Hear the street, and then occasionally you may see a Chinese sign. Here's another street scene. And here is the main association of Chinatown. Here's another one. It says the Casino Zhonghua, which is one of the main associations of Chinatown. Here's another association sign. And here is the front door of the Chinese newspaper that used to be published here. Another plaque outside a building that signifies a Sociedad de Recreo, or a sports center or recreation center. And here we see something that's quite interesting. Is the martial arts school in the Barrio Chino, one of the few lively spots in the barrio, but serving mostly non-Chinese students. And finally, you might notice this faded sign, which is the old Chinese theater, now converted into a Cuban art gallery. So what do I want you to know? I want you to know that walking through Chinatown, you don't see Chinese people. You see a few Chinese signs and you see the gate, but you don't see Chinese people. Now, if we walk out of Chinatown, which I'm, by the way, what you don't see, and I can only capture the feeling of Chinatown in the pre-revolutionary days with some old photographs, you would have seen in the old days the streets lined with bodegas or shops or tiendas like this all over Chinatown. And if you glimpse into the window of these restaurants, you would see a lively scene of the Chinese enjoying a banquet to celebrate some event. All of this is gone. But if you look around a bit, you might see a little alleyway where you begin to see a few Chinese restaurants. But even these Chinese restaurants and the people who attend to the guests are not Chinese. They are mostly tourists. Here is another Chinese restaurant without much Chinese. And then sometimes these Chinese restaurants might sponsor a familiar Chinese site, which is here in this case during Chinese New Year a couple years ago, the Lion's Dance. And of course, all the noise or the drumming attracts a crowd, but look at this crowd outside the Chinese restaurant enjoying the Lion's Dance. You don't see many Chinese in the crowd, perhaps this gentleman, but not a Chinese crowd. So we just went through Chinatown and we don't see Chinese. We see Chinese signs from the old days. We just don't see Chinese people walking the streets of Chinatown anymore. Now I'm going to take you outside of the gate of Chinatown and we're going to go through the streets of Chinatown to look at the transportation system. And here is one of the newer model cars, but most of all, you will see lots of new model buses. And if you look hard at the buses, you will begin to see just like this bus and this bus. Oh, wait a minute. Okay. and you see a Chinese sign that says 中国鱼通, the Yutong bus. And the Yutong bus is the main mode of public transportation in Cuba today, as well as the tourist buses that all tourists use. So China has imported, someone tells me 5,000 to 6,000 of these buses to Cuba to solve the big public transportation system. So we've seen Chinatown, we don't see Chinese. We walk out of Chinatown, we see Chinese buses and Chinese cars, the Geely brand of private cars. Now I'm going to take you to visit a typical Cuban home and a quick look at what they use every day. And what do you see in common? Here's a Chinese television. And if you turn on the television, you see a Chinese program, Huawei cell phone, a Chinese cafetera, a Chinese microwave, Chinese fan. And here's one of my very favorite photos, Fidel Castro trying to buy a Chinese rice cooker. So where do we see the Chinese? Well, this is a huge Chinese embassy in the Vedado area that occupies an entire city block. And you see some staff members here. So what has happened to Cuba? Well, let's go back a little bit in history, and I can very quickly run through the history that the Chinese arrived in large numbers in the middle to the late 19th century as contract laborers. About 125,000 landed in Cuba, and they worked under 8-year contracts of hard labor, and they worked alongside African slaves on the sugar plantations. But after the 8 years are up, and after recontracting for some additional years, they acquired residency in Cuba and began to build small businesses and ethnic communities commonly known as Barrio Chino, such as a big one in Havana we walked through. And these Barrio Chinos were filled with associations, newspapers, restaurants, and small businesses, and smaller barrios springing up all over Cuba in the provincial towns and cities. In the 20th century, when sugar was king, from the 20s to the 50s, free Chinese immigrants went to Cuba. No longer under contract, free Chinese immigrants, 20,000 or more, settling in Havana and in the provinces. And they made the Havana Chinatown a really lively spot in Havana, a top tourist hub with lots of nightclubs and what I call the body floor shows. Okay, so here's a nice photo of a Chinese contract laborer working on a plantation late 19th century. And I just want to show you very quickly the contract because it's a very unique contract in Latin American Caribbean history. This is a bilingual contract. There's an English, a Spanish version that says it's an emigración about colonos asiáticos or Asian settlers, no? So it's very nicely worded, but in Chinese it's quite interesting. The other side of this contract is, as I say, bilingual. It's one of these unique Chinese documents, and it says it's a voluntary labor contract overseas to work in the island of Cuba. So quite different. One is immigration, one is labor. So where are the Chinese in Cuba today? In the 1960s, when the revolution nationalized private businesses in Cuba, most of the Chinese began leaving the island to Miami, New York, Puerto Rico, wherever other Cuban middle class and businessmen and capitalists went. A few returned to China. Being a socialist country that does not permit foreigners to own and operate businesses, except for certain state joint enterprises with China, Spain, Italy, hotels, for example, Cuba has not attracted massive new Chinese immigrants as is occurring in the rest of Latin America and the Caribbean. But where you can find visible and culturally discernible Chinese in Cuba, if you know where to look and how to look, and I'm going to finish my brief talk today by showing you where you're going to find the few Chinese remaining. Here you see them gathering on a very important day, the Qingming Festival, which is their version, a Chinese version of the Dia de Muertos, where you go honor the dead and go to the cemetery. But first they will congregate at this monument in the Vedado area. And this monument was erected in the 1950s to honor the Chinese who fought for Cuban independence from Spain. And they were honored with this phrase, by Gonzalo de Quesada, there was no Chinese Cuban deserter, there was no Chinese Cuban traitor. In other words, there were Chinese Cuban mambises or freedom fighters, such as we have captured in this photo. So here is Guillermo, one of the oldest Chinese immigrants still remaining in China, at the monument on the cemetery day. Here is another descendant. Look at his features, and I'll come back to that. And here's Georgina, whom I know, and she was actually not Chinese. She's a full-blooded Cuban, white Cuban, who was raised by Chinese and raised in Barrio Chino. She speaks beautiful Chinese, and most of all, she sings Chinese opera. And here we have a young man who says he's a fourth generation descendant of the Chinese. And here we have some of the cemetery placards that you see in the cemetery, in the Chinese cemetery on the cemetery day. And here we have some old bones that were never repatriated to China. And we have lots of these old bones of the old Chinese immigrants that are still in the Chinese cemetery, and they will never return home for proper burial. If we go to the Casa de Abuelos, which is a government retirement home in the Barrio Chino, we see another very elderly Chinese man being taken care of by the government. We see a few in the provinces. Here is a president of the Chinese Association in Santa Clara. And if we go into some of the Chinese Association, we might see the scene of Chinese with some elderly Chinese playing dominoes. Okay, here is Ramoncito, who's one of the very few younger Chinese born in Cuba who remained in Cuba and did not leave, trained as an engineer. He now works with his mother in one of the Chinese restaurants. And here are some of the other elderly Chinese, just like this picture here, also in one of the Chinese restaurants. And where do we see the younger Chinese? Here are the third and fourth generation performing martial arts in front of the Chinese ambassador during Chinese New Year in one of the associations. So that's where the Chinese are. They are the younger descendants of the Chinese community who are of mixed racial heritage, and a handful of very elderly Chinese whom you might find if you know how to enter the associations or the old people's homes, the Casa de Abuelos, and find them living out their days. So who are in my estimation, for me, my emblematic Chinos Cubanos, no? So I want to introduce you to Wilfredo Lam. I noticed that Julie Hertzberg is in the audience, and Julie, if you're listening, Julie is an expert on Wilfredo Lam, the painter. For me, Wilfredo Lam is an emblematic Chinese Cuban, a great Cuban artist, of course, friend of Picasso, whose paintings hang all over museums all over the world. His father was Chinese. His name was Lam Yam, but his mother is described as a mulata called Ana Serafina. No? So Wilfredo Lam, Afro-Chinese Cuban. No? Two of Wilfredo Lam's sisters, Sarah and Luz. He kept his father's name Lam. He never used his mother's name, which is quite common, the segundo apellido, the second surname, but he always just kept Lam, his father's surname. He described his father, who was quite elderly, as muy culto intelectualmente y sus paisanos le tenían mucho respeto, meaning his father was well educated, knew how to read and write, and often wrote letters for his paisanos, compatriotas. He grew up in the Barrio Chino of the town called Sagua La Grande, alongside elders. This is Wilfredo Lam, I mean, such as his godfather, the shopkeeper Guillermo Glenn, who's also a mixed Afro-Chinese Cuban, no? Whose grandfather was Chinese and his grandmother was a mulata. And besides his parents, Wilfredo and siblings grew up surrounded by other Afro-Chinese. They seemed to be the norm. In the barrio, he learned to eat Chinese food and some Chinese words. And I visited the barrio today. Of course, it's not a barrio anymore, but you can still see the street called Calle Tacon in Zaguala Grande, and you can still see the main Chinese association with the name Casino Zhonghua right here in the front. No? So here just Wilfredo Lam, I had to stick this in with Picasso and one of their favorite pastimes, which is the bullfighting. Wilfredo Lam, known for his paintings such as a jungle, no? And when I brought images, copies of this painting to China, the Chinese said, oh, bamboo shoot. That's what they saw, what Cubans see as the caña or the sugar cane. So why is Wilfredo Lam important? Because he is the Cuban embodiment of Afro-Cubanidad, no, Afro-Cubanness. The greatest cultural influence on Wilfredo was probably his maternal aunt, the mulata Mantonica Wilson, who was a Lucumí priestess or santera, who infused Wilfredo with the Afro-Cuban cultural and religious beliefs and iconography so central to his artistic expressions of Afro-Cubanidad, which you see in these famous paintings of Wilfredo Lam. It was perfectly natural then that the Cuban who gave the greatest expression to Afro-Cubanidad should be an artist of mixed Chinese and African heritage. And here is Matonica Wilson, his aunt, who was probably his greatest influence in his cultural and artistic expression. There were others like Wilfredo Lam, such as Regino Pedroso, who's a celebrated Afro-Chinese Cuban poet. And his fellow Cuban poet, the renowned Nicolas Guillen, describes Regino Pedroso and his spiritual essence this way. Nicolas Guillen says, here one can see it flow, it being the spiritual essence or the blood, flow like a wide and slow river whose waters pass through Asia and Africa before arriving in Cuba. You can check out Pedroso's collection of Chinese poems entitled La Ciruela de Yuan Pei Fu, the plum of Yuan Pei Fu. And my last slide, I want to introduce you to someone that, should you have the pleasure of visiting Cuba soon, you can actually go look him up in Regla in his studio. His name is Jose Ung. Jose Ung is an Afro-Chinese Lucumí priest of the Cuban Santeria religion. And he is also, for me, the emblematic Chinese Cuban. Thank you very much. Tomorrow, when Cuban government loosens rules governing private businesses to allow foreigners to invest in the retail sector, new Chinese immigrants will rush to Cuba as they are already rushing to the rest of the Caribbean and throughout America. So I am predicting that it is only a matter of time before we see Chinese people on the streets of Havana and in the provinces. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Evelyn. And now we're going to have listen to Ruth Behar.
Sorry, everyone. I was having the same problem Evelyn was having, that things moved around. Are you able to see my screen at this point? But you see all the slides?
Yes.
Yes.
Correct.
How is this? Okay, we'll start now. Okay, how's that?
You need to open the entire presentation. We're seeing the whole series of slides.
Okay. I'm not sure how to do that. Use slideshow. Ashley, do you want to coach me through this?
Yes. So at the bottom of your screen on the right side, you should have like a little presentation screen that will also let you present. It's like a little button. So you see next to like the zoom in and zoom out, right next to it, next to the minus sign, it should be that button right there.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not used to doing it this way. Can I do it my primitive way?
Yes, for sure.
Okay. How's that?
Yeah, that's
Perfect.
good.
That's working? Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry for this. Well, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much, Professor Dwani, for having me. And I'm going to get started right away to be sure that I don't go over time. So the Jewish story, in some ways, if we take a very long perspective, begins in 1492. 1492 is the year of the expulsion of the Jews from Spain and the beginning and the rise of the Spanish Empire and the conquest of the Americas. So Columbus lands in Cuba, and he's accompanied by Luis de Torres, a converso, who might be the person over to his left with that green and gold outfit, holding onto a flag as well. And so we know that there was a converso presence in Cuba. These were Jews that had converted to Catholicism and fleeing the Inquisition and so on. And many found their way to Cuba. We don't know that much about them, but historians are starting to research that presence more. And so we know that Sephardic Jews, at least it's a legend, that when they were expelled from Spain, they were given the choice of either converting to Catholicism or choosing departure, that many of them took the keys to their houses with them on their exodus out of Spain. So that's where my title comes from, about my ancestors' keys. And so anyway, so there's this converso presence, but really there isn't a public Jewish presence in Cuba until after 1898, after the Spanish-American War. Up until then, it's one religion, Catholicism, and one crown, the Spanish crown. And it's after 1898, after the US enters Cuba and establishes a protectorate and so on, that freedom of religion comes to Cuba, and Protestantism arrives in Cuba, as does Judaism, as does baseball. And interestingly, there's a group of American Jews that settle in Cuba first. And one of the first things that they found on the landscape of Cuba is the Jewish cemetery, which is on the outskirts of Havana in Guanabacoa. And you can see it's founded in 1906, which I think is really interesting. There has to be a space for the dead before there's a space for the living. And what's interesting, again, is that these American Jews settle in Cuba first. They establish restaurants and other businesses arriving in Cuba in the early 20th century, but they're a very small community. They do have their own synagogue in Havana, a Reform synagogue with an English-speaking rabbi. So they maintain their American identity while they're living in Cuba as expatriates. So that's the first community to establish itself in Cuba. Now, we know about the rise of xenophobia in the late 19th century in the United States, and in this anti-Semitic cartoon, you can see the rise of anti-Jewish sentiment and the rise of xenophobic ideas as well. And that leads to the passing of the Immigration and Nationality Act in 1924 that seeks to limit the numbers of people arriving from Eastern and Southern Europe. And they establish a quota system. Just to see very quickly here, you can see how low the numbers are for Poland and for Turkey. This is for entering the United States. And so this leads particularly many Jews trying to flee Europe in that period between World War I and World War II to find their way to Cuba. And I'm going to show you some family photos to give you a sense of this history. These are my paternal grandparents who were Turkish. They were Sephardic Jews, and they find their way to Cuba in the 1920s. They meet in Cuba, but they're both from the same town of Silivri, about 40 minutes away from Istanbul, and they find their way to Cuba and meet there and marry, and they form part of this Sephardic community that takes form in Cuba in the teens and 20s. They found the first synagogue, the Shevet Ahim synagogue, which ironically was located. It's now closed down because it has a sinking roof Malouf, but ironically, it's located on the Calle del Inquisidor, on the street of the Inquisitor, is where the Sephardic synagogue gets founded. And so that's on my father's side. And then on my mother's side, the Ashkenazi side, my maternal grandparents were from Russia and Poland, and they were a part of a very large migration from Eastern Europe. And they also meet and marry in Cuba. Interestingly, my maternal grandfather, who originally was named Moishe Gliniensky and becomes Maximo Glinsky in Cuba, he worked on the railroad in Cuba. And he was always very proud of this. He would always show me his railway ID card. The Jewish men who arrived were penniless and they worked at anything that they could. Many of them were peddlers, but he was always very proud that he'd worked on the railroad, building the railroad in Cuba. My grandmother was from a Polish town called Goworowo, near Warsaw, and you can see a little map here of the town. And she arrived first. She begged her father to let her be the first to go to Cuba and help him bring the rest of the family, which she did. Over many years, she worked with her father, my great-grandfather, who's the man there in that Panama hat, who looks a little bit like Jose Marti. They settled in a small rural town called Agramonte in Matanzas, and I pay tribute to this history in my recent novel, Letters from Cuba. And so we often think about Cuba as not being a welcoming place for Jewish people because of what happened in 1939 with the St. Louis ship that was turned back. These were 934 German Jewish refugees seeking refuge in Cuba, fleeing from the Nazis, and they were not allowed to enter Cuba. And as a result, this always comes up when I give talks about the Jews in Cuba. People tend to think that Cuba wasn't a refuge, but that really isn't true. This was really an exception to the rule. It was a very, very sad chapter in Cuban history. They were turned away, but they were also turned away from the United States and Canada and sent back to Europe. And many of them, fortunately, were able to survive, but quite a few of them also perished in concentration camps. So that sort of burden of memory is often placed on the shoulders of Cuba, when in fact Cuba turned out to be a very strong refuge for Jews seeking religious freedom. This is just a map to show you the Jewish presence in La Habana Vieja. There were many, many Jewish-owned businesses in that area, and very logical because most of them had small shops, a lot of schmate shops, as we call them, cloth shops, but all kinds of small businesses in that area. My maternal grandparents had a lace shop on Calle Aguacate, and it was very convenient to be in La Habana Vieja and be able to go to the ships, to the docks over there, Avenida del Puerto, and pick up the goods that you needed to sell in your shops, or peddlers as well, who continued to sell things throughout Cuba. So this little map just shows you that by the 40s and 50s, the Jewish community was pretty well established in Cuba. There were about 15,000 Jews. Then the numbers again are somewhat estimated, with the primary community being in La Habana, but they also spread out all over the island of Cuba, which is fascinating. They had synagogues, still have synagogues in Santa Clara, Camagüey, Guantánamo, Santiago de Cuba, and then you find Jewish cemeteries, sometimes scattered in the most unexpected places like Camajuaní. There's a Jewish cemetery there. So this Jewish presence on the landscape of Cuba is important, and it takes place during this period of the 40s and 50s. Many Jewish people used Cuba as a kind of trampoline to then go to the United States, but those who stayed really felt that they were Cuban. They wanted to be part of Cuba. They didn't want to go anywhere else. Cuba was their America. And one of the most poignant things that the Jewish community does in the 50s is they build this Casa de la Comunidad Hebrea de Cuba, what they then call El Patronato. This is the big Jewish community center in El Vedado, and designed by Capablanca, the great architect. And of course, the building is still there, and I can tell you more about it later. And it's poignant because it's the mid-1950s. They found it in 1953. It takes a little longer for it to finally open. And this is their sense of, we're going to stay here. We're building our community center. They also expand the cemetery in the same period, and they think they're going to stay in Cuba forever. So it's very, very poignant, as we'll see in a moment. And they accommodate and acculturate in many ways and become Cuban in many, many ways. Here they're offering an homenaje to Martí in Yiddish, which is interesting. So blending these two two cultures. And even as late as 1960, this was Rabbi Gambach, who I knew personally. He's publishing this Haggadah for Passover, right, which a holiday which is just passed this past week. But similarly to the story that Evelyn shared with us about Chinese Cubans, the majority of the Jewish community leaves after 1961, after the Bay of Pigs invasion, after the government turns to communism and properties are nationalized, small businesses are nationalized, and even my paternal grandfather, who was a street peddler, is no longer able to peddle. He was by no means rich, but that's what he did. And so this mass exodus of the Jewish community takes place in the early 60s. This is in fact my maternal grandmother leaving Cuba, the woman holding the box there. And so they leave, and there's a lot more I could tell you there, but we could come back to that. And then I eventually find my way back to Cuba. It becomes very important to me to reconnect with the community that's left on the island, to find the keys, and to go back and to see who's there, what has happened to the patronato, to the Torahs, to all the aspects of Jewish culture that stayed behind on the island. And I briefly went to a Jewish day school in Havana. You can't really see it there, but there's a Jewish Star of David there on my left. And so I was briefly sent to this Jewish day school where instruction was in Spanish and Yiddish, which is fascinating. It was the school my mother was sent to, and they wanted, of course, to send me to the same school. So this was very important to maintain the religion, to maintain the culture, and so on for the Jewish community, while also trying to blend in. And here I am in front of the Patronato synagogue that I was mentioning before, and going back and trying to recover as much of this history and who's left and what has happened since the revolution. And one of the key people in the community, I'll only have time to introduce you to a few people, I don't want to go over time, is Adela Dworin, who is now the president of the Jewish community. And this is inside of the Patronato, in the library of the Patronato, where her office is. And she's an extraordinary person, a fluent Spanish, English, and Yiddish speaker, and very much kind of the heart of the community to this day. And it's fascinating for me that the Patronato, the synagogue that meant so much to that pre-revolutionary community, now has become a kind of pilgrimage site. And you continually find people, well, up until the pandemic, of course, going to visit the Jewish community, and always stopping at the Patronato. This is where people stop. I've been there many, many times when this has happened. People stop and go, "Oh, are there Jews in Cuba?" And this is where they go to find out, and they visit this synagogue. And Adela frequently shows people around. So this presence of outsiders, kind of reaffirming this Jewish presence, is very important. And it's meaningful to me because we lived half a block away from the synagogue. So this was part of my childhood as well. And so there's been a lot of American Jewish interest and global Jewish interest in this small community. It's now a community of about 1,000 people. This is a Havana tour bus stopping right at the entrance to that cemetery, the first slide that I showed you. And the cemetery becomes one of the sites to visit in a Jewish tour of Cuba, which is complicated and interesting. And so in my research, I was really interested to see what people had held on to of the Jewish past, holding on to things like the prayer shawl, the talit, holding on to pictures of the era. These are pictures of the last quinceañera held at the Patronato in 1959. And Sara, at the end of telling me her story, said, I am the only one of all those women still left in Cuba. So the sense of being almost shipwrecked in Cuba. And I traveled all over the island searching for Jewish people living there. This was Jaime Gans Green, who since passed away. And he lived in Palma Soriano. He was the only Jewish person there, but he had stayed there all his life, and held up this incredibly wrenching picture of a postcard that was sent from a concentration camp. And you can see the Hitler stamps that was sent to a relative of his in Cuba. And of course, the Cuban government has been very aware of this interest, this outside interest in the Jewish community. And a number of years ago, they built a hotel called the Hotel Raquel while Eusebio Leal was still alive. And it's a Jewish themed hotel, and all of the rooms are named after Jewish protagonists in in the Old Testament. And of course, there's the Ruth room, and I stayed there, and I've written about the irony of staying in a hotel room that's called the Ruth room. So I wrote about all of this in my book, which is also in Spanish. And just to close up, because I have no idea how much time I've spoken, but I'm sure I've gone over. So I'm just going to end by just giving you some quick photos of the contemporary community and kind of what's been going on since I wrote my book. It's interesting that there are Jewish people in the provincial cities. This is the synagogue in Santa Clara, and there's a small group that's still active there, and this became their symbol, and you can see them, putting together the island and the menorah there. This is the community in Guantanamo, a very active community as well. So that's very, very fascinating, and I've been really, struck by how the community seeks to be part of the global Jewish community, and here they are, presenting their hashtags for We Remember Yom HaShoah, which is in the next few days, the Holocaust Remembrance Day. So being part of this global community, and they have much more of an online presence now. They're on Facebook and so on, and they communicate that way. The community really depends on outside support from American Jewish communities, Canadian Jewish communities, and Latin American communities, and they receive things like gefilte fish and other Jewish foods for the holidays. A couple of years ago, I caught them making humataschen for Purim. And here, all of these girls, and you can see the different phenotypes here. The community is much more mixed than it was, very similarly to what Evelyn was saying. The community is much more mixed than it was in the pre-59 era. And now the community both faces inward and faces outward. And this was a Hanukkah party just a couple of years ago, and they do these really big, splashy parties, and they invite people of other religious faiths and leaders of other religious faiths to be part of these celebrations and these parties and the sharing of their identity. So I'm going to stop there because I don't want to go over time. Thank you so much for listening.
So now we're going to hear from John Ermer.
Hi, thank you everyone, and thank you Dr. Douani and the Cuban Research Institute for hosting this really important discussion. I'm honored to be here. All right. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Great. All right, well, let me just begin by saying that evidence suggests that as early as 1870, an Ottoman subject named Jose Yabor lived on the corner of Monte and Figuras in Havana. But the earliest mention I've found of a Lebanese or Syrian community in Havana comes via these baptismal records that you see here. These came from the Parroquia San Nicolás de Bari, and they were two families that baptized their children on the same day. Both of them were listed as naturales del Líbano in Syria. And in fact, the records suggest that migrants from Syria really started increasing in number beginning in the 1880s. And by the 1920s, Cuba boasted the 6th largest Arabic-speaking population in the Western Hemisphere, after only the United States, Argentina, Brazil, Canada, and Mexico. Yet scholars have noted the relative, quote, invisibility of Arab migrants in the Americas, and particularly in Cuba. Cuban historian Eurídice Chacón has called Arab migrants or immigrants in Cuba rather, the most assimilatable, in her words. And numerous studies of immigrants to Cuba have generally brushed over or excluded mention of Arabic speakers. Elena Fidian-Kazmia has illustrated this point by noting the significance of how, quote, the 1959 revolution officially celebrates Chinese immigration as one of the 4 principal components of Cuban identity, while ignoring the Arab component, whose demographic presence appears to be equal, if not higher, end quote. And again, those 4 components are the, quote, Indian, Spanish, African, and Chinese, end quote. What's clear is that by the late 19th century, Havana's Arabic-speaking community had established a foothold in the area around San Nicolas Parish Church, which is right here off the Calzada de Monte and San Nicolas, Calle San Nicolas here, if you can see my cursor. That corridor, Monte in particular, kind of became the heart of the community. But not at first, right? Because like Ruth had mentioned, a lot of the Jewish immigrants to the island were peddlers, and so too were the Arabic-speaking immigrants. They mostly used Havana and other urban centers as a base, and started to make their living pack peddling before eventually maybe buying a store in one of those urban centers. And this was particularly true in Havana, but also in Oriente, where little nodes of Arabic-speaking communities started to pop up in Santiago, Manzanillo, Holguín, and some other places. In fact, some of the earliest mentions of Syrians in Cuba come via court records in La Gaceta de La Habana, and those court records were summons usually for quote-unquote Turcos, as many Ottoman subjects were called at the time, whether they were ethnically Turkish or not. And often accused, quote, Turcos of committing petty theft or being dishonest in business dealings, as was the case with Rished Aoun, a Turco and silversmith by trade, who was accused of estafa or swindling. And while some cases involved more serious crimes like murder, they mostly perpetuated images of greedy or thievish others, like the Turco known only as Antonio, who was accused in multiple summons of stealing eggs from a local woman. Following independence, some evidence suggests Syrians continued to face prejudices and often fell victim to exclusionary immigration policies that denied them entry or deported some residents, as was the case in 1908 with the deportation of Abraham Nasser. And I would be happy to talk a little bit more about any of that. And you can see San Nicolas Parish right there. Kind of became the spiritual home, as I'll talk about a little later. Still, in the face of these challenges, some of the earliest Lebanese and Syrian immigrants to Cuba worked hard to establish ties to the island and carve out a place for themselves and their relatives. Some of the earliest Syrians arrivals served in the Cuban Liberation Army, as you can see here, with the Mambis Libanese, or the Mambi Libanese, or other Mambises Libaneses like Alejandro Haddad, Aurelio Elias, Esteban Haddad. In 1947, a Cuban man named Jose Salome claimed to be of Lebanese descent. He was a rancher outside of Manzanillo, and responded to a call for listings in the Guía Social de Habla Árabe for the Circum-Caribbean, and self-identified as a comandante of the Cuban War of Independence. Other Lebanese and Syrian migrants no doubt contributed to the Cuban struggle for independence from Spain and national sovereignty. In 2019, I took this picture of Elia Tuma, or Felipe Elia Tuma, but there are other examples, as I've noted. Trying to hurry up here. In 1912, El Figaro also published this article. It was in a high society magazine, El Figaro, about Gabriel Malouf, who owned a successful luxury import and retail business, he claimed housed in the home built for Máximo Gómez, the famous general of independence. And Malouf built quite a substantial fortune for himself. He counted among his friends the public servant and politician Fernando Figueroa Socarrás, and the future president Alfredo Zayas, both of whom attended his funeral in 1918. And you can see that some of his, some of his employees at La Verdad, his store, took out this announcement for his funeral. Also, the organization he founded, Progreso Sirio, took out an ad in the paper as well, and both of these came from Diario de la Marina. So while Malouf enjoyed a great personal success and acceptance in Havana's high society, he understood the challenges that faced others like him. His nephew points to the fact that he was able to create these networks both in and outside of Cuba to help him face some of these challenges of living in Cuba in the early days. But Progreso Sirio was kind of his baby, right? This was his way of giving back to the fledgling Syrian Lebanese community in Havana. But his organization wasn't the only one. It was one of the earliest, but mutual aid and cultural associations provided Cuba's Lebanese and Syrian migrants with a vehicle through which to rehabilitate their collective image and assist fellow migrants attempting to establish themselves in Cuba and connect with their compatriots across the Atlantic and the Levant. Like other mutual aid societies for other ethnicities in Cuba and across the Americas for that matter, Lebanese and Syrian associations like the Unión Libanés Sirio de Beucal, El Ittihad, which is Arabic for the Union, the Sociedad Libanesa de La Habana, prioritized providing, quote, protection and aid to the sons of Mount Lebanon and Syria residing in this Cuban Republic, end quote, but specifically, quote, to avoid as far as members' resources extend that children of Mount Lebanon and Syria in Cuba suffer misery and or public burden, paying special attention to women and those disabled by age or vice, end quote. Aside from this, Lebanese and Syrian organizations in Cuba and the Americas remained influential in politics in the Levant, offering aid, exerting political pressure from abroad, and sending remittances to members' families. Yet, as immigration from Lebanon and Syria to Cuba began to wane around the mid-century, organizations remained particularly active and in their missions to, quote, represent all Lebanese in general and particularly members to defend their rights, spread progress among them, and socially enhance their name in Cuba. So one way that they did this was by holding outdoor cultural festivals. The Sociedad Libanesa de La Habana was famous for this. I have an account of the planning for the 1959 event that shows various entities around the city, various venues vying for this event, including the Coca-Cola bottling plant in Havana and the Cerveceria Modelo, which is where they eventually held the event. They would have traditional food, traditional dance and music, and all of that. But this was the culminating event. This was the end of the day. The day would begin for Lebanese Independence Day on November 22nd with a 10 a.m. wreath laying at the statue of Jose Marti in El Parque Central in Havana Central Park. And then they would process down Monte to the Parroquia San Nicolás, where they would have a mass celebrated in traditional Maronite Catholic tradition from the Maronite Rite by one of their own, a priest, Butrus Abi Karam, and they would then go back to their meeting place, which was there also on Monte, very close to San Nicolás, where they would read telegrams that they would send both to the Lebanese ambassador in Washington, as well as to the Lebanese president and, quote, people back home in the Levant. One Syrian man described these sorts of celebrations and festivals as, quote, like joining him by an invisible cord to his Aleppo, as described by his son later on. It really was a way to not just connect with each other, but also to broadcast to the general Cuban public that they were part of Cuba. They were a unique ethnic group within this umbrella of Cubanidad, right? So again, I told you we'd go back to San Nicolás. So I took this picture a few years ago at the Parroquia de San Nicolás, and it is a small altar off to the side of Saint Marin, who is the Lebanese hermit monk who founded the Lebanese Maronite rite within the Catholic Church. So this is a rite within the church that is in full communion with Rome, though they were cut off for a few hundred years before reestablishing contact with the Roman Church later on. And it is very much like any other Catholic Mass you would find, but it's a little different. The ceremonies and prayers are said in Syriac, which is a variation of Aramaic, it's kind of just very unique in that way. And you can also see this letter from the Maronite Patriarch of Antioch to the Archbishop of Havana at in the early 20th century. And I'm trying to hurry up here a little bit. So one of the ways that they kind of broadcasted their Cubanness was by broadcasting those similarities in culture, right? And Catholicism, for many of them, not all of them, but for many of them, was one of those similarities. I took this picture here at the home of a Cuban-born woman of Lebanese descent. Her name is Renee Cheriak Daour. And you can see a lot of things that you would typically see in a Cuban home, right? Especially a proud revolutionary home. But you can also see this certificate of recognition from the Unión Árabe de Cuba that I'll talk about in a second, as well as this image of Saint Charbel, who again is a Lebanese saint of the Maronite rite, right next to La Virgen de la Caridad and a little bit over from San Lázaro over here. So there's this blending of cultures, like Dr. Behar was talking about earlier, very much present in this home. But talking a little bit about acceptance on the island, I've spoken to various people here in the United States as well as in Cuba about how they felt accepted by other Cubans. And Felipe Jaber, a man who I interviewed here in Miami actually, said that my dad wanted to be a socio of the yacht club Ipeca in Manzanillo, and they told him no. I was so excited to go and bathe in the ocean there, and no, they told him no. And that made me sad. I cried. I was a child, imagine that. I cried, knowing that they didn't let my dad join because we were Moros. They called all the Lebanese Moros. They called me Morito in the university. My classmates would say, "Come here, Moro." And that, in that time, brought consequences because despite my father owning a store, and in spite of my being a member of him being a member of the Masonic Lodge in Manzanillo, he was discriminated against. But I also have accounts, and that's the end of the quote. I also have accounts by others, especially living on the island, that talk about a very welcoming Cuban population too. Rosita Diaz de Cheriak talked about how Arabic language use was something that she lamented never learning, and maybe that was because her parents wanted her to fit in more, right? So she says, quote, "Very few children in Lebanon of Lebanon here speak Arabic. I'm not sure why. In other countries, they did. I went to the Dominican Republic once and enjoyed meeting descendants of Lebanese because there were many there too, and they speak Arabic, but we don't. I don't know why. From what I've read, the Lebanese are casi completamente aplatanado. My grandparents spoke Arabic and continued to speak it. My mother said she understood it, but I don't. We have a school now at the Unión Árabe de Cuba where we give Arabic classes on the computer. To her, it was very important that they start to teach their grandchildren the Arabic language as a point of connection. She continued, the Lebanese were very social and knew how to have a good time. They were always amiable. The Gallegos were not as nice nor as accepted. The Cubans always had a problem with them, but with the Árabes, it wasn't so. The proof is in who my family married. My grandparents had 10 children, 8 daughters and 2 sons, and they all married Cubans, and my grandchildren all married Cubans. Of course, we were all members of the associations, and that being the Arabic or Lebanese associations. But we always mingled with Cubans. The Cubans accepted the Lebanese, and the Lebanese accepted the Cubans. We never had problems. They've always played nice, end quote. And finally, Renee Dor de Cheriac, whose house this is, and this is Rosita, the lady who I just quoted, holding up her Lebanese cookbook that she wrote for the Unión Árabe here. Renee Dor de Cheriac said, quote, "They felt more Lebanese, her parents that is. Here there are both. The Cubans were born here in Cuba. My parents were Lebanese, but Cuban citizens. They believed in Cuba, but they always lived thinking about Lebanon. Lebanon was always, and then she starts to get a little upset and started to cry and said, we were never able to go back. And that is where I kind of ended that conversation. So there was always an attempt to maintain ties to the Levant. And here's just a list of some famous or semi-famous Cubans of Lebanese descent or Cuban immigrants or Lebanese immigrants in Cuba. Natalio Cheriac, who was a lawyer, he was the Lebanese consul in Cuba, even though he was born in Cuba. He was the founder of the Inter-American Bar Association, the Federación Interamericana de Identidades Libaneses, and other organizations that are too many to even list here. Julian Salub Duel built, owned, and operated the Hotel Copacabana. Moises Cheriac, who is the director of the Central Clinic in Havana, and Alfredo Gabriel Malouf, who was Cuban Minister of Justice from 1959 to 1972. He started off as Deputy Minister of Justice under the revolution for about a month until he took over as the actual minister. And then, of course, Emilio Estefan, who is the Cuban-born music producer and Grammy Award winner, who is of Lebanese heritage as well. And here are just some pictures that I took at an event at the Unión Árabe de Cuba. This is my last slide. You can see the Lebanese and Cuban flags flanking the flag of the Unión Árabe. There were a lot of associations prior to the revolution. However, like we've heard with the other two presentations, after the revolution, a lot of the people of Lebanese heritage left the island with the rest of the middle class. They went to Miami, New York. A lot of them returned to Lebanon, although not all of them stayed there long term. A lot went to Mexico, where there's also a large Lebanese Spanish-speaking population. And eventually in 1979, the Cuban government just combined the remnants of all the associations under this umbrella, Unión Árabe de Cuba. But this was an event to welcome the new Lebanese ambassador to Cuba. And so you can see here, there was a belly dancing display. There was also a concert put on by one of their members. And there were speeches, of course, like you get a lot in Cuba. That's all I have today. I look forward to any questions, and I look forward to the next presentation as well. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you, John. And now we will hear from Elisa Romulo Borges.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'll make it short so we can go ahead and address your questions. Let me know if you can see my screen. Let me test it in a minute. All right. Okay, so we started with Asia. We returned to East Asia specifically, this time the Japanese and Okinawan descendants in Cuba and their contributions to Cubanidad. The plaque that you see in the picture is actually part of a statue located in Havana Bay. I will show you a full picture in a few moments that commemorates the friendship between the Cuban people and the people of Japan. So the translation is for the friendship, the eternal friendship between the Republic of Cuba and Japan. Some keywords that I will not spend too much time here. Ajiaco, which is Cuban stew, kind of the Caribbean take for the melting pot that we use here. The kasagi or the kaseki, it's another important word seen in the literature, just because it entails that the immigrants, right, that went to Cuba, Japanese and Okinawan immigrants, always had the intent to return. So there was a lot of them did not plan to stay. It wasn't part of their contract, but they did. They ended up settling in the island. Nikkei is the word that is used to designate Japanese and Okinawan immigrants, and otaku, we will address that a little bit later. It's just a term for geek. And I also use, of course, cubanidad. And I want to give a big thanks to Dr. Martin Sang, who I believe is present today. His research really helped me kind of gear my own and format my own research with the Japanese and Okinawans, even though his is the Chinese community in Cuba. This is the statue I was mentioning before. The man you see was part of the Keicho embassy. His name is Hasekura Tsunenaga. He actually arrived in Cuba in 1614. He did not begin the immigration of Japanese and Okinawan immigrants to the island. Actually, he was just there for a stop. The embassy, the Keicho embassy, took place from 1613 to 1620, and there were basically people from Japan that were visiting different countries. Migration, pull factors, shortage of labor, and the sugar boom in Cuba. They followed the Chinese migration waves. The opening up of the Panama Canal actually made it easier for these immigrants to make it to the island, and of course, the wars. A little bit more in history, the official date that they have for Japanese migration is 1898 with the arrival of Pablo Osuna. He actually had a Japanese name, but a lot of them tended to just change their name to a Hispanic name, and he arrived to Cuba from Mexico. The first Okinawan arrived to the island in 1907, 1908, depending on the source that you look at, and we will see that shortly. And the testimonial that I included there is just to kind of emphasize the situation, right? That Okawa Hisao mentioned that he arrived to Cuba in 1925 at the age of 18. And the economy of the country was really bad. So one of the pull factors was definitely economic benefit, and the boom was in the 1910s, 1920. This picture that you see to your left is actually an Okinawan family. And the reason why I make the distinction between Japanese and Okinawans, Okinawa is part of Japan today, but it was actually colonized in the 1800s. It was called the Ryukyu Kingdom. It is called the Ryukyu Kingdom. So that's the reason why I make that differentiation in my research as opposed to putting them all together. So this is an Okinawan family. The gentleman and the lady, Catalina and Jorge Uyema, are both second generation Okinawans. There's no longer first generation Japanese or Okinawans on the island, unfortunately. And their granddaughter is a fourth generation. So the Okinawan workers were the largest in number and similarities due to the similarities, of the climate and the vibrant sugar industry of Okinawa. And that's why I added the little map there so you can locate mainland Japan versus Okinawa. And from the immigrants, there is that differentiation, whether you are Japanese from mainland or you are Okinawan. And the Okinawans have their own relationship with the Okinawan government, as well as their association in Cuba, separate from the Japanese association, which they're also a part of. These are some pictures that I took in the Pantheon, Japanese Pantheon in Colón Cemetery. And the focus of my research basically centers around Ortiz's theoretical framework. As Dr. Sang, and this is what I was thanking him before, he mentions that there's little participation granted to Asians, right, when he was referring to the Chinese. And I use that to kind of fuel the research, because really there isn't a lot written about the Japanese and Okinawans, and they definitely become or have formed part of this Cuban stew or ajiaco. If you notice from the pictures, you have the blending of religions, which is usually how we see it the most. You have the candle, Cuba was a Hispanic colony, therefore they have Catholicism as an important religion, but you also see the offerings. You see the incense in the picture to the right, you see the crane, the paper crane, and you also see the little, the noodles. Those are instant noodles. So they received that and they added it to as an offering, right? And there's a Buddha. The picture in the middle is a Buddha. It has been deteriorated over the years, and it's part of one of the tombs there in the Colon Cemetery. Here to the right is the work. This is in the Great Theater of Havana, known now as Alicia Alonso Theater. This is one of the exhibits that took place in 2020, actually, right before the broke out of the COVID pandemic. The work is by Ryuho Hamano, which is an artist and calligrapher who brings out the Nikkei experience through his work. So those that you see there are actually the last names of Argentinian Nikkei that are exhibiting, they're being exhibited in the Alicia Alonso Theater, contributing to this idea of Cubanidad. And then what you see to the right is a pamphlet that was passed down in Cuba to celebrate the 100 years of Japanese presence on the island. This particular picture is also the work of Ryuho Hamano, and this is a permanent exhibit. And these are the last names of Japanese and Okinawan descendants. And we can't talk about ethnic minorities without addressing a little bit prejudice and racial discriminations. From what I have gathered, most of this happened during the wars. Concentration camps were established from 1941 to 1946, specifically in Isla de Pinos, Isla de la Juventud, Presidio Modelo. All males were imprisoned in here, 18 and over. And post-war, they face harsh treatment, specifically from the American companies established in the island. Exemplar workers could not find their job anymore. They were not offered their jobs back. There's accounts of these workers, right, who otherwise did excellent before the war broke out, reaching back to get employment, and they were denied this opportunity. There is also an Hacienda Cortina, which is a part of a park in La Guaira, and there's a lot of Japanese artwork and historical documents there. So Japanese were big contributors to this, to the cultural legacy of Hacienda Cortina. After the war, due to economic reasons, they were denied also access to this locale due to economic status. So, but it's important also to mention that even though there are highlights of discrimination after the war, there's a lot of mentioning of Cuban friendship and how the Cuban neighbors really helped the women when the men were all in prison. So that's something that is always highlighted in the literature, and also by the living descendants of these individuals with whom I had the pleasure to talk. In order to avoid discrimination and racial prejudice, what they did was basically just avoid the public eye, right? So they all tried to stay in one place that was away from all attention. In this case, Pinar del Rio, known as the La Cenicienta. Back then, they used it kind of as an escape from discrimination and racial prejudice. So they moved there. There was a network of support established. So individuals who had already been settled there, who had their businesses going, will yield a helping hand to the newcomers. And as a matter of fact, one testimony from one of the Japanese descendants is that if there was something good that happened out of their imprisonment in Presidio Modelo, was that they all got to connect with each other. They were brought from all parts of the island and they all got to meet each other. So it facilitated this networks of support. This is also part of the Japanese, well, the left is part of the Japanese pantheon. And you see how all the descendants and the remains of the descendants are kept there. To the right is a tomb of a Cuban that married a Japanese, second generation Japanese woman. He cannot be moved into the pantheon until his wife passes away. So that's the way to enter kind of the pantheon, unfortunately. But they did go ahead and created a special place for him, and the Buddha statue is actually there right next to the tomb. That's the picture of the Asa dance, which is an Okinawan dance, and the Shisa, which is the Okinawan lion. And if you notice at the top, this picture shows what does not look like Japanese or Okinawans, right? Practicing this dance, so kind of to reinforce that how the blending of the cultures. And to address a little bit the importance today, or what does it go today, this is what I was mentioning, the Otaku Festival. This took place in 2018, and it became more available to the Cuban citizens through what is known as the package, or el paquete, which you have access to different programs, specifically in this case from Japan. So they all kind of custom play and created this festival. To the left, there was for the celebration of the 500 years of Havana, kabuki play took place. So that's what you see there in the left. And then again, the exhibit by Ryuho Hamano, which was a little bit later, was last year. So you see a new exposure to Japanese culture, a new visuals into this culture that we didn't have before. You have it from the side of pop culture with the package, right? The access to internet, and you also have it from a more traditional point of view. There is, this is the name of the exhibit, and kind of like my main slide to wrap it up. The translation is Nihon no Kasa, that's how you say it in Japanese, and the translation is Winds of Japan. And what do the Winds of Japan bring? Integration, cooperation between the nations, which they still do, a little bit challenged now with COVID-19, so we'll have to see that take place. They still celebrate Obon. Obon is kind of the Japanese version of Qingming, as Dr. Hudahar was mentioning before. Celebration to the ancestors, which is very important in East Asian culture. And what they did though, and this is again to emphasize the blending of these cultures, Obon takes place traditionally in August. And they celebrated actually 2 weeks into the month of December, just because there is the All Souls Day on December 2nd. So they kind of the blending of religions happens here. So that's it. Thank you so much. We can go ahead and proceed to take your questions. So I give the word to Dr. Duani.
Thank you, Elisa. And now we have a few minutes for discussion. And I know there's a couple of questions in the chat, and I would encourage people to add more of their questions. We'll take as many of them as possible. But for now, I would like to maybe start the conversation by asking the three presenters, apart from Elisa, about the concept of transculturation, which she has used very much in her work. So I wonder if Evelyn, Ruth, and John find it useful to describe the processes of interaction between these ethnic minorities that they talked about and Cuban society by using that concept.
Of the concept of transculturation?
Transculturation, yes.
Yeah, that's Fernando Ortiz's main concept. I thought it was interesting that John says, and using Professor Chang's, who is in the audience anyway, John, his analysis that Chinese were not, or Asians were not included in Fernando Ortiz's idea of the ajiaco. But on the other hand, I try to show that people like Nicolas Guillen, Regino Pedroso, there's Sadoy, there's a whole bunch of writers who do integrate the Asians, in Cuban society into their concept of Cubanidad. That description that I gave about Nicolas Guillen, saying that through the veins of the Hino Pedroso, flows the rivers of Africa and Asia to become Cuban. So that seems to be a pretty clear expression.
Ruth, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I didn't use the term, I said accommodation and acculturation because I wasn't sure that it fit for the Jewish community. I think that they struggled to accommodate and to definitely feel Cuban in so many ways. But at the same time, there was a fear of losing the culture, losing the religion, losing the history. And so they also, in some ways were very closed. And to such an extent, I didn't get to talk about this, that the different ethnic differences within the Jewish community were also maintained, so that when my parents married an Ashkenazi Jew and a Sephardic Jew in 1956, this was considered extremely unusual. And the two sets of families were very worried that they would lose the different Ashkenazi and Sephardic traditions. So I think it's a wonderful concept and I love it, but I'm not sure that it totally fits for the Jewish community. I think they were very concerned to lose something essential, although they had no desire to return to Europe. I mean, unlike what was said about the Lebanese and the Japanese and so on, they had no idea of ever going back to Poland or Russia. Like they were done. They were done with those. Those home countries were not home anymore for them. Cuba was home. So in that sense, you can say they transculturated, but at the same time, there was this concern, not to lose their Jewishness.
Thanks. John?
Yeah, I would agree. It's not a perfect fit. Rigoberto Menendez, who is the president of a museum in Old Havana called Casa Los Árabes, and has worked on this topic as well, has said that I think he would agree that perhaps the less financially secure of the Lebanese and Syrian and Palestinian, for that matter, migrants in Cuba did attempt to undergo this process of transculturation and kind of fully embed themselves into Cuban society. The elites certainly, and the middle class for that matter, through these transnational networks that connected to their businesses, as well as families back in the Levant, maintained a sort of diasporic or transnational, I'm not entirely sure what the term should be there, but something else, right? Some other identity apart from being Cuban or Syrian or Lebanese. It was more of a I guess transnational sort of understanding of where they fit, right? Camila Pastor called it a floating island of elsewhere, and I really do like that description of it.
Great. Now here's a question for Elisa from Sergio Hernandez, who I think is joining us from Mexico. He wants to know how many Japanese descendants are now living in Cuba.
Combined Japanese and Okinawans, roughly 1,300.
And is that a decrease from the top period in which they migrated?
Yes, a little bit. It was never major like the Chinese, the migration wave, but it's definitely represents a decrease because all the first generation have passed away and that they have intermarriage with Cuban people.
Great. So we have a number of comments in the chat, which are not really questions. I'm going to skip over most of them. But one in particular, this one is for John from Gene Rosenberg from FIU. He wants to know that since you emphasize the Maronite Lebanese, what about the Muslim Lebanese?
That's a great question. The majority of the Syrians and Lebanese who left Lebanon and Syria for the Americas in the late 19th and early first half of the 20th century were primarily Christian. Putting a percentage on it gets dicey, but there is scholarly agreement that the majority were from Christian religious sects, right? So whether that be the Maronites, who in Cuba certainly were the largest, or Greek Orthodox, or Melkites, who are the Greek Catholics, as they're sometimes called, they comprised the majority of these migratory waves in the early 20th and late 19th centuries. There were certainly Muslims, and I have been able to identify a few in Cuba. And in fact, the Sociedad Libanesa in the 1950s argued about who had the rights to be buried in their panteon in the Cementerio Colón, right? Whether it should be reserved for the Christian majority or whether they should allow for Muslim members of the association to be buried there. And it was quite a contentious debate. So I think part of the reason why we don't have a lot of records pertaining to the Muslim Lebanese, Syrians, Arabs in general in Cuba was, one, because they were numerically the minority, and two, they were somewhat marginalized by the Christian majority, right? Yes. Who wanted to present the community collectively as similar to Cubans culturally, right? And part of that was these claims to Christianity and Catholicism.
Thank you. So there are a few questions for Evelyn, and I'll let you look at them either now or later, because there are quite a few from Alberto Benki.
Yeah.
I think for now, since we have just a very little time, if you can comment perhaps on how the Chinese immigrants choose Cuban cities to settle in. And then the next question, which has to do with the practice of adopting Spanish surnames. And
yeah.
How do they do that?
I was trying to respond to Mr. Benki. Alberto, why don't you email me? Because I can send you lots of things about your ancestor. Kaohsiung is one of the key sending counties of Guangdong province. The majority came from there, and I've written plenty on that. Spanish surname is like slavery. You know, whoever owned these coolies, they're called coolies, no, the contracted laborers, whoever owned slaves oftentimes gave them their names. And I have some beautiful stories to illustrate exactly how that happened. Okay, so name is a very interesting thing, but you know, what John was saying, and Elisa and Ruth, I think religion is a big issue. And you didn't hear me say anything about religion about the Chinese, because they didn't have a major religion, and religion did not influence their culture so much, right? Which is one reason why I think that they acculturated, if you will, to Cuban, and that many of them adopted the Santeria religion as well. So the Chinese surname, that where they came from, I think one difference between the Chinese, as I hear the rest of your talk, could be their numbers. There were 125,000 who came in. That's a far larger number, I think, than any of the other communities that were discussed today, right, Jorge? And yes. Then, yeah. So I think that the numbers made a difference. Secondly, they were widely distributed all over Cuba. Wherever sugar was cultivated, you could find them. In all the haciendas, they were Chinese, right? So their widespread dissemination could be another big factor too. And then the third factor was gender. I didn't hear any of us talk about gender, but it's between the lines of everything we said. The vast majority, I mean, Ruth talked about the Jewish immigrants and her own parents and grandparents. Seems like there were more family immigrants in the Jewish community. There were more families perhaps in the Árabes, but there were no women to speak of in the 19th century. So they were all men. And I think that really did affect the way the second and third generations were reproduced or produced in Cuba. I shouldn't say reproduced, because the Chinese had a much harder time truly reproducing themselves since there were so few women for so long.
Thank you, Evelyn. We have time, I think, for just one more question. And I see on the chat, we have two sort of broad questions for Ruth about the Jewish community in Cuba. And maybe you can converse with her by email. But I think the first one, maybe you have time to answer, which is what language is spoken at the homes of Jewish immigrants in Cuba, and how did they preserve the culture and religion of the Jews?
Yeah, I'll be really fast. And Ada, feel free to email me and I can give you more information. But interestingly, after a time, it depended generationally. That first generation that immigrated to Cuba, the Eastern European Jews spoke Yiddish, and they tended to speak Yiddish among each other. But then they learned Spanish. They spoke Spanish with a Yiddish accent, which I didn't realize till I was older, and could say, wait a minute, their Spanish is a little wacky. It seemed normal to me because it was what I heard, but their Spanish had a Yiddish accent, that first generation of immigrants. Then the next generation, like my parents, who were both born in Cuba, my mother heard Yiddish all the time. She heard her parents speak Yiddish, within the family. But then they all spoke Spanish in public and they learned Spanish in school. But then they had that schooling in Havana where you learned Spanish and Yiddish. They were really trying to preserve Yiddish before Israel became a state, and Hebrew became the official language of Israel, but it was really Yiddish that they were trying to preserve. But in the end, it was really Spanish that dominated. And on the Sephardic side, they spoke this old Spanish, we might call it. It's not really an old Spanish, but just to be fast, it's called Ladino. And it's the Spanish that Sephardic Jews preserved after the expulsion, and they continued to speak it, even when they were living in places like Turkey. So that my paternal grandparents spoke this other Spanish, this old Spanish, and they spoke it with each other, but they didn't pass it on that well. That was more Spanish, I would say, that was spoken. And then with regard to intermarriage, yes, intermarriage after the revolution with that small community that stayed behind on the island, yes, there's been a lot of intermarriage since then. And I forgot to say that the majority of the Jewish community today in Cuba, the small community of about 1,000 people, the majority are converts to Judaism. They are people who've married in and have converted to Judaism, or have found an ancestor, a grandparent or great grandparent who is Jewish, and have entered the community. There are only about 10 people left on the island who are Jewish on their mother's and father's side. So this presence of conversos, or Jews by choice, as we call them, is a very important part of today's community on the island.
Thank you, Ruth. And unfortunately, we have run out of time. Thank you for your insightful presentations, as well as the questions that were raised by the audience. I wanted to mention before we go that we will post the video recording of this presentation on our Facebook and YouTube accounts, and we'll post the digital link as well. So if you want to see the whole thing again, or maybe you missed part of it, you can access it a little later. So thank you all, and hopefully we'll see you in another face-to-face or perhaps virtual event such as this one. Good afternoon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And thank you, Jorge and Ashley.